We're going to start with the panel right away. And of course, we will have enough time with Dr. Wolfgang Gressmann, who just joined us at this panel to explain more what was planned in the introduction part. But I would like to, with no delay, start this important part of the conference. The opening, the starting issue is the democracy under siege. And I would like to introduce Mr. Sasha Ordanovsky, Dr. Sasha Ordanovsky, a usual suspect speaking about democracy. And online we should see soon Professor Eilders, Christiane Eilders of the Heinrich Heine University, all very prominent representatives of the expert community across Europe and the world. Before diving into the topic, I'll just need to check if we're missing someone else. No, that's and of course we do. We have our distinguished participant, Heather Robertson Gaston, who is coming from, I see that there is an empty chair, who is coming from the United States. And she is a human rights expert. I will start right away with Mr. Ordanovsky. We heard the introductions of the distinguished ambassadors, also Minister Liminski. I will just go very briefly. Democracy is in crisis. Are democratic powers, structures, individuals and groups able to defend democracy? Now you can just start, yeah.
Can I? Yes. No, they're not.
No, okay.
I will have to leave 3 minutes to 11, and Jabir knows
Yes,
that, so I'm
yes,
very sorry.
yes.
We just came back from Brussels with Professor Edward Joseph. Yesterday, we had a 3-day visit to NATO with the young leaders from the Balkans. It was a very good project supported by the US mission there, and a lot of discussion there was actually aimed for the same topics, and especially media, disinformations, and so on and so forth. And they prepared a document which is the recommendations from the youth from the Balkans, what NATO should do in the Balkans. And it can easily be found on the websites. I have some printed copies. It attracted a lot of attention by the General Secretary, with the Deputy General Secretary Shekerinska there. Of course, she spent 30 minutes with us. So I'm just saying that we are fighting back. But how it is going to be, it's still a long way to go. I would like, since I have only 5 minutes, I can concentrate on one issue, and that's the answer to the question is related to the media. Look, I'm always telling to my students in the last 20, 30 years, more than I would like actually to remember, that journalism is not about truth. Journalism is about facts and a relevant context. This kind of, liberal democratic kind of preaching that we are selling the truth to the audience, of course that in the end, journalism is more about the process of truthfulness. It's more about the destination than the facts. But most of the journalists, even seasoned journalists, do not understand that on the same facts and on the same relevant context, you can have at least 2 truths, not to mention that you can have 100 truths. Yeah. So if your facts are not good, if your context is not good, then you're a bad journalist. But still, if your facts are good and you have a relevant context, it doesn't mean that you will have only one truth. Why I'm saying this? I'm saying this because in this critical time, there are three missions that journalists and editors and media are doing in the previous context of how media were working. Very important things. One is the gatekeeping. So the traditional media were the gatekeepers of this zillion kind of, look, NATO is following daily 1,200,000 websites, daily. So those websites, if they were traditional media, they were the gatekeepers of what information gets to the public. The second very important role was the agenda setting. So when this, out of zillion information you offer 300, 400 news daily, then the second thing is agenda setting, meaning that you say, look, this is going to go on the front page, this is going to go on the 8th page. So out of 300 news, you're actually setting the agenda for the day. And the last role, and I will explain why I'm saying this, this is something which is maybe more technical. The last role is actually framing. So the media, the last role is putting an angle to already set its agenda after the gatekeeping process. So the media would give an angle. So yes, these are the 200 information today out of 200 million. Yes, these are the most important and less important. This will keep 50 minutes on the website. This is going to go down. And this is our angle of how we see it. So what I'm trying to say is that that was how professionals in media were doing their job in the last decades, because that's what we were doing, that's what we were teaching at the universities, because journalism is not a science, it's a set of skills. So to become a good editor is actually understanding these things, because these things are also a question of skills. Now, in the last 10 years, we have a big fight between editors, journalists, media, traditional, and so on and so forth, versus algorithms. You see, algorithms do not have this kind of editing process with skills. That the business model of algorithms is different. Algorithms are and we all know that, currently. Algorithms are actually, internet should have been the marketplace of ideas. And it started some 20 years ago like, nice, we all have, expanding ideas, and we can exchange things and so on. Today, internet is a rabbit hole. Why? Because algorithms are actually dealing on your clicks, not on the importance, not on the angles, not on the framing, not on the gatekeeping. It's a classic thing. Negative news are better news for clicks than positive news. In politics, in democratic terms, that's why liberal democracy, look, liberal democracy is playing with hopes. Other people are playing with fears. Fears are much better clicking mode than hopes. And in this rabbit hole, not only that we are not we, I'm not saying about professionals, I'm saying about 98% of the public, people who do not understand these things. We are jumping into this rabbit hole, and then algorithms are just pushing us lower and lower into that rabbit hole. And there is a lot of research. I'm teaching not only communication sociology. In the last 10, 15, 20 years, there is a mountain of research to prove all these things. A very recent one was actually founding that last week published, that 75% of reposts are done without people actually clicking into the content. They react emotionally, they react in their ideological value, whatever frame. So they don't even open the news. They're just, because they want to, they do it emotionally. So when they do it emotionally, it's a huge thing for manipulation. New generations, look, I used to have students who were doing like this on their phones. They will see the first screen, and then they will go at least one screen more to go deeper for the information of the first screen. Today, they're going like this. So if you cannot explain the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in one screen, not more than 3 sentences, you are lost. Now, can anybody explain Palestinian or whatever in one page? So this is where we are. What is the solution to end here? Because this can take a 3-day seminar, and we are actually doing that and discussing this. That's why regulation is very important. That's why we need a kind of a middleware between the content and to get back to this kind of moderation that professional journalists and media were doing in, talking to the public. I think that one of the biggest problems, I wouldn't say mistakes, because that's something which is, you have Elon Musk who is creating public opinion. You do not have the editor-in-chief of New York Times who is doing that, So that's one of the huge problems, especially for liberal Democrats, because this kind of media are stolen by populists. They're playing on emotions, they're playing on personal reactions, and they're playing on hate. Why? Because the business of algorithm is actually supporting and encouraging that kind of a rabbit holes we are all in. I will stop here. Because
I want to get at least one line from you. What should the Democrats do, the Democratic or Progressive or Moderates do in order to...
Part of this project that we were in with NATO was last year, exactly a year ago, we were in Tallinn, in Estonia. Estonia is the most digitalized country in the world. Fabulous experiences. We told NATO, look, we are a small country, Montenegro is a small country, let's share some experience with Estonia. We had splendid program there. Estonia has a 24 hours police office open for internet, kind of dirty language, kind of disinformation. So any citizen can send a mail and say, look, this person is spreading misinformation. They have a capacity to actually fact check this. Look, I don't know what is the operational daily there, but they had, when we were there, they had something like 10 people working on that. What they do then, if they find that it is a misinformation, disinformation, so they call the person or they debunk that it's a bot. But if it is a real person, they call him on a discussion. So the person who is spreading misinformation is warned by official office of the police that he is doing harm. So, look, it's more complicated than I'm trying to say. We immediately said, look, in Macedonia, you will need 10 offices like this. One office wouldn't be enough, But Estonia is having 25% of so-called Russian speakers. So they have very similar challenges as we are having here with multi-ethnic and so on and so forth. So what I'm trying to say is that there are ways. In Estonia, it's a part of the system. None of the Western Balkan countries is having a system. We are having initiatives. Germans are financing this, Americans are financing that. We have this conference, then something, the Interior Ministry is doing this, that. There is no system. There, it's a system. So we should establish a kind of a system, not a big brother system, but a system which will be a kind of a middleware between this huge pressure of anger, hate, misinformation, and the general public. We cannot do it. It's a big discussion in the world, of course. I'm not very optimistic that we'll, but things are moving on. Until we come to that stage, I don't think that we're going to win this.
Okay, I don't want to let the other party missing you.
I'm really sorry I have an online. I told Jabir I need to be there. So
whatsoever, it was very important, very good starting point from which we can go on.
I'll come back later.
That's
after 12.
Splendid. All right. Okay, then.
Thank you, sorry.
Have a good day. Thank you very much. Do we have Professor Eilders online?
I'm sorry.
Professor Eilders.
Hello.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us today. Were you able to see the beginning of this panel? And
yes, I was very. I liked very much the different directions with the swiping on the telephones. Very impressive. Very good.
Professor, could you share with us your experience in the areas in which you're researching, analyzing, collecting knowledge? Well, I would go on with this with the same question. Can the democratic or pro-democracy forces in the society do something to defend democracy and human rights in the face of war, far-right nationalism, and authoritarianism, authoritarian tendencies? Do you have a better consideration or better view on this, or more positive view on this question than Mr. Ordanowski, who said that democratic forces are not able to defend democracy and human rights.
Well, very question would be complex answers, but there's not enough time to dive into the whole subject. But I'm a researcher on polarization, and I would like to focus on the role of media in polarization, and that's also about emotions and hate, but it has a little different. The focus is a little different.
Yeah,
and
that's
I do think,
also very important, of course.
yeah, and I do think that wars and conflicts, of course, are very important topics for this conference because they're very likely to disturb and disrupt democratic processes, and that's what we are here for, right? To talk about disruptions and how we can prevent that. Conflicts might divide societies into camps of supporters and opponents of, let's say, Ukraine or of Israel, but also think of less severe conflicts, such as domestic policy conflicts on taxes, COVID, or migration. They also have the potential to polarize society. And what's so bad about that? What's so bad about opposing opinions? And that's my starting point. Isn't that just pluralism? Not always. If there are distinct and strong opinions and there are strong feelings involved, a conflict can threaten democratic processes because it might develop into a standstill of discursive exchange. And that is needed for democratic opinion formation and decision making. Discourse is a prerequisite of democracy. So the exchange of opinions can take in person, but mostly it is via the media, and we have heard about agenda setting and framing 5 minutes ago. That's important. I would like to focus on the particular role of social media in this. How does mediated public communication drive or deepen conflicts? And how does it ease conflicts and bring people together? So both directions are perfectly possible. So I wouldn't be so pessimistic about the media systems contributing to better democracies. The thing is that media have been suspect of deepening conflicts, of turning democracies to less worse performance and so on. And that is alarming because media used to be regarded as infrastructure for democracies, bringing people together, helping people to form opinions, and so on. So the fact that that's not always the case anymore is already alarming. So why are we talking about the malfunctions of media? And this is not a very new topic. It is a very old one, and the discussion about the decline of political communication has started in the 90s by Blumler and Gubovich. And they identified 4 ages of political communication and showed how the democratic functions of communications deteriorated over time. In the 3rd age, that was just before the social media became popular, they already showed a strong decline. Intensified professionalization pressures, increased competitive pressures, anti-elitist populism, we already heard something about that. Centrifugal diversification, that's the first sign of polarization. And changes in how people receive politics. All that contributed to less democratic well-functioning. And that all makes it obvious that not everything was good before social media came about. But now we're in the 4th age, and that is the age of online communication and particular of social media. And all these malfunctionings became more pronounced. And now we have another problem, the linkage between social media and journalism, because people encounter news via personal networks now. And this brings in more emotions, and via the trust towards the like-minded peers that they are networked with, there's also more chances to change opinions through media content. So they encounter a mass media piece, some sort of report on whatever, let's say Israel, via friends, and that gives increases the chances of adapting their opinions in the direction of this media item. And this increases polarization, or the chances of polarization. But so far, there is not much evidence of polarization in many countries. At least in Germany, there is little evidence of polarization, and there is little evidence of polarization through social media, although it has the potential. So why worry? Why worry if there is little evidence of polarization right now? Because things can change, and because it's completely different in other countries. Let's just think of the red and blue media communities in the US. So we have to be cautious and watch very closely what is happening in other countries, and how the increasing ideological gaps can be prevented if that's the case. The ideological gaps, that is what is referred to as ideological polarization. And as I said, there's little evidence of ideological polarization via social media, but that can still pick up. There is more evidence of affective polarization, and affective polarization is an emotional rejection of an out-group through the in-group. So this is we and this is them. And there's a lot of hate involved and devaluation, and basically it's all about the rejection of the out-group. Social media fosters this rejection through its affordances, because it relies on emotions, it relies on outrage, because this is how people are kept on the platform. So that's the business model in a way. In network publics, the in-group is more likely to come into being, because that's how they find like-minded peers and form a camp which is likely to reject other camps. So the emotional rejection of a group, and this is what affective polarization is all about, that indicates a lack of willingness to compromise on political issues. It makes discourse across opinion camps more difficult. But this is how democracy works. We need discourse across opinion camps. We have to interact, we have to compromise and find solutions. And this is also a way how to integrate society, and without integration, there is no stable foundation of democratic societies. Now, if things are lost already, how do we depolarize society if we are already split up into opposing camps? Of course, media education and media competence help a lot, especially if disinformation is the cause of polarization or other sorts of malfunctioning. We heard about disinformation. But sometimes a society polarizes even without disinformation. Opinions just move away from each other. So what can we do, and what does research tell us about possible ways out of that? There's a lot of research on the effects of moderation in discourses, of human moderation or bot algorithm moderation. But the findings of moderation, it's a little optimistic, but it's not clear. And it depends very much on the type of moderation. The findings on cross-cutting opinion presentation are also very inconclusive. We yet don't know under which conditions someone changes his or her opinion. Sometimes the presentation of opposing opinions drives people even more towards the extremes of a spectrum, let's say left-right spectrum. And we don't know when that happens and when different opinions help. So what do? There is so little research so far on the effects of polarization and on ways to depolarize societies that I would recommend try it out. We have to collect more best practice examples, to make more experiences on ways to depolarize discourses, because that's the only way to go. We can't just accept it. We have to prevent further disintegration because that threatens democratic decision making. So far, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. I guess we've got some of the answers of these initial questions within the panel discussion that we somehow envisioned as an initial starting point from which we will try to give an answer how to defend democracy and human rights. We've been on this continent so far. I would invite you to fly over the Atlantic. And, actually, our participant today flew over the Atlantic to us. Heather Robertson, who is, please scan the QR codes and go to the agenda. This is as much as paperless conference as possible. So you will find bios and more information about the participants. And back to you, Ms. Robertson Gaston. What actually happened in the States?
Can people hear me? Oh,
yes.
Okay, good. I think I can bring some good expertise here to this question. You can see on the website some of my, some of the research that I've been doing in North Macedonia, but in terms of my research in the United States and my work there, I don't think I really included that, but I have worked on democratic campaigns, and I've worked on issue campaigns, primarily organizing volunteers, organizing people to get involved in issues that they care about, and on campaigns that are important at the moment. So, but on top of that, North Macedonia, and I just have to say to the people in this room, I'm so grateful to the people in this country for speaking to me over the years. I have been researching Macedonia for something like 2 decades, and the reason I bring that up is that there are some similarities, I think,
Yes,
between the two places.
They're almost like United States of America.
Yes, okay. Well, okay, so I've got my little list here. That's why I'm looking at my computer to prompt myself.
Sure.
Okay, so obviously we have this problem of rising racism that you can see in both places, very much connected to the economic situation in both places, connected to the ongoing war in Ukraine and the disinformation and polarization that goes along with that, which is something that I can sense so much more acutely in North Macedonia. And in the United States, we're just, we're much more isolated. So it's not quite as obvious. But we can talk about that more because I'm still working out a lot of my thoughts on the way that disinformation works in the U.S. And I'm really interested to hear what other people think about it. But okay, so we have that. We have this sort of ongoing, I was saying, economic crisis, inflation, that obviously everyone in North Macedonia is very familiar with. People in the United States are also familiar with this. And I think what tends to happen is that even though this is a global phenomenon, you know, the price of medicine is higher than it should be. It's harder to get a doctor than it should be. It's harder to get housing than it should be. Just things feel so dysfunctional. This is you know, it's global, but people experience it locally and don't necessarily know that the whole, you know, almost the whole rest of the world is experiencing this. So it's very hard for any incumbent party to stay in office in that situation. Because people think, you know, well, who am I going to support? Well, not the, you know, not the people who have been working and, you know, in my opinion, not in my opinion, in the opinion of the voter who is voting against the incumbent, I wouldn't, you know, that voter would just want to take a chance on a change. And so I've seen that in Macedonia, in North Macedonia, excuse me, that's not a political statement when I say Macedonia, it's just force of habit. But I saw that in North Macedonia before the most recent elections, and I saw that in the United States as well. Just this kind of desire to try something new. Then there is the disaffection that I think is really a huge problem, this desire to kind of retreat from the democratic process. So in North Macedonia, what I saw before the May elections, I met so many people who just didn't plan to vote. And announced it very quickly. You know, I won't be voting. I'm not voting in this election.
Why was it so?
It was, well, I think people are so frustrated with, you know, political processes, lack of progress, even though, you know, progress is being made. It just takes such a long time. It's not easy to repair after COVID, after you know, hundreds of millions of dollars were spent by the previous party in power on you know, various buildings and statues and things like that. It's not easy for a new government to take over and get things right. And the same thing happened in the United States. It wasn't easy for the Biden administration to just fix everything. And as I was saying, it's a global phenomenon, right? Yeah, right. So I do think that disaffection also, it can make a person feel like, hey, I figured something out. I figured out that this whole system, you know, which takes a lot of time to understand, I'm not even going to take that time anymore. I'm not going to take the time to participate. I'm just going to exit. I'm going to retreat to the mountains or to, you know, to my life, and stop engaging. So, like I said, I saw that here before the most recent elections, but I saw the parliamentary elections I'm referring to, and I saw that in the United States right after the election. And I did see it before as well. I mean, it's a long-standing tradition. People just don't vote and people don't pay attention. And, you know, I've got my volunteers like knocking on doors. Did you know there's an election happening? And who's running? You know, how could you possibly not know? But people really do disengage. But afterwards, people are saying things like, you know, we'll never have another democratic election again. We'll never, there's no chance. Democracy has no chance from here on out. And, you know, meanwhile, there are people like me saying, oh, really? Because we have elections, you know, each state has elections as well. And these elections matter. They're coming up next year. You should do some things. You can also run for political office yourself. It's, you know, it's not like autocracy is just built like that. It's people quitting and withdrawing and not challenging these systems that really is what helps them win. Okay.
Sure, this is absolutely interesting, and of course it's good to reveal all these elements of the reality, of the new realities in the United States. But do you have a recommendation on what to do, because this conference is all about it, to try find strength, reasoning, and actionable recommendations.
Yes.
So do you have, maybe it's too early to speak about the United States, but maybe some thought of yours about Europe, about North Macedonia, which of course is very similar to the United States, at least if we look at the January 6, 2020 and the 27th of April 2017 in the country. You know, it's a pretty similar situation. One had one type of flags, but you know, in the States there were also horns. You know, we didn't have such elements in the 27th of April. Maybe for some next occasion. So, do you have some thought to share with this audience, with the public? What should we do?
Yes, I do. I mean, I'm sure there are so many reasons that Trump won. I should have said that before. You can't just point to one, you know, and you can't point to five.
Right.
It was completely,
Right,
he won in too many places to say it was this one thing, you know, it was racism, it was sexism, or the reasons that the other reasons I listed. But this issue of disaffection and lack of kind of interest in democracy is really toxic, because when people stop valuing democracy, or they just say, look, it doesn't offer what it says it offers, it just doesn't, they are less, I think, less upset when somebody takes democratic opportunities away, because the whole idea has kind of, the air has been taken out of it. Okay, but what I will say in terms of solutions is that there are people who are really good at bringing people into the fold, bringing the disaffected into the fold. And it's such a skill, and like I said, not everyone has it, but it involves empathy, it involves, you know, forgiving someone for being totally different from you, it involves meeting people who are completely unlike you, and allowing people to save face if they've done something that, you know, they think, I shouldn't have voted for that person, or maybe I should have voted after all. Kind of extending kindness and saying, well, join in anyway. You know, come and meet other people and come into the fold instead of retreating. And so when I see people and organizations that are able to do that, campaigns are often not able to do that, but organizations, people that, you know, do this again and again and again, work on things like human rights and democracy, they can be very talented. And those people all over the world, in the United States, in North Macedonia, really deserve our support. So that's my solution.
Thank you, Heather, if I may. That's really an inspiring thought. Let's see if it works. Sure. I would like to wrap up this panel also announcing that there will be on the big screen once more the video address of Minister Leminski with translation, of course. But I would also announce that these two persons, Ms. Robert Gaston and Dr. Ressman, are also going to be on this panel in the second and in the fourth panel as moderators. And you will see me in the fourth panel as a member of the panel with Heather here, if I may, Heather. So I would propose that maybe in the second panel you go more in the topics, but now I would like to invite Dr. Wolfgang Gressmann, the president of the Media Dialogue, a very important person for Civil Center for Freedom, and also a great connoisseur, a very experienced person in these processes and the fight for democracy and human rights. Briefly introduce yourself and introduce our project, and maybe longer speak in the other panels. Thank you, and thank you for being here. Dajte go ovaj mikrofon.
No, nothing happens. Oh, it happened. Yeah. Great. So thank you very much, Xavier Derella and Civil, for this great event today. I was very happy, and I am very happy to be a part of this development. We are for the second time here with the support of North Rhine-Westphalia. Some words about my person. I am coming from public access media, participation of people, or participation of young people, education of young people making media, teaching also responsibility of, of media and using them naturally in a democratic, based on democratic values. So I'm chairman of the national organization of 150 public medias, from university radio to free radios in Germany. And based on this, we started with the Media Dialogue project with the idea to support, when we started in 2015, the Ukrainian society. We started at Kiev 1 year after Maidan, in their development and their process for self-finding, and to discuss, and that was one important thing. I think this is also very important for democracy development, to do it on eye level, not to come and to say you have to do, to take the people with you and to show young people, but also the elder ones, lecturers from the universities, that democracy means to work together and to find common solutions in discussion. This is one of the main point, and to show, that was in the Media Dialogue project, after we involved Belarus in 2016. We didn't know what happening later. We will hear from Xenia in the next panel. And Georgia and Armenia are involved, and Moldova too, to bring the students and the lecturers to produce own medias, which are shown also in German public screens. To not that I think the big audience, but to bring something in the mind that democracy means you can work without censorship, that democracy means own engagement is needed. And one point that is also, I think, very important for all countries, also in North Macedonia, democracy means also trust. Trust in the political system, trust in justice, also trust in politicians. And in the process of elections, and therefore it's necessary, I think, to have in mind what's going on in the internet and the other medias, but also what's going on in the justice system, sorry, what's going on in the political system, in the parties. And there is a crisis, I think, a big crisis at the moment in Europe. North Macedonia, I think you're well informed. So this trust-building process, re-trust building, let's say, is for me one most important thing. And to build re-trust means also international work. That means also to bring people from different countries, democratic countries, or countries which are developing democracy together with young people, with older people, with lecturers, universities, but also with working journalists like Mika, the chairman of the German Journalists Federation, is here a guest too, to bring them together and to discuss our issue and to bring it to society and to show the failures in society and the whole democratic system are existing in the justice, in the politics. Corruption is one of the words everyone knows what that could mean, and to explain how parliamentarian democracy is working. That's also an educational process, but it's also an invitation, like today, to work together in a world without war. And when we don't do it, we see what's happening. We see what's happening in Belarus, in lands of dictatorship, and even in Ukraine, where democracy abolished, the danger of war is rising. And this is the thing we have to think about, and we should be, I think, realistic optimism is my expression, but as strong Democrats to fight for democracy, to fight for our rights, but also to fight for the rights of others in a democratic way, to find solutions and not polarization, to overcome this polarization. And media are also a very important instrument to overcome polarization in a society based on international work, cooperation, knowing from each other that the same problems, perhaps with differences naturally, are in the Western world in the moment on the agenda. And when you have a look to the Eastern world, to Russia and its propaganda machine and the results of this machine, this bloody results of this machine, I think there is no alternative in fighting for democracy, and this is the point, the main idea of media dialogue.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ressman. Of course, while I was listening to all these distinguished ladies and gentlemen experts, I was really delighted by the ideas, but I'm alarmed by a question all the time, and it is the question if the world has time. Because right now, while we're in this conference room, a brutal war against a sovereign nation is being waged, and a hybrid warfare has been waged for more than a decade against the free world. And the world is getting darker because of that war, and because of the hybrid war that the Kremlin is waging against the free world. And maybe this is food for thoughts for the next panel, which you're leading. And of course, I don't pretend to know the answers, but I think that it's very important to start posing the critical questions and have in mind that we don't have much time.